Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to Assessing Obama's First Year, the 2009 Political Communication Lecture Series, sponsored by the Department of Communication, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the School of Urban Affairs and Public Policy. Laurence S. Seidman is Chapter Tyler Professor of Economics at the University of Delaware. He received his BA in Social Studies from Harvard University and his PhD in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of many articles and 10 books on economic policy, including a book entitled The Automatic Fiscal Policies to Combat Recessions, which was published in 2003 and is directly relevant to tonight's lecture. His teaching and research focuses on macroeconomics and public finance. Tonight, Professor Seidman will be speaking on the administration's economic policy and the recovery.
Oh, that's okay. Well, it's great to be back in this room. I used to teach Economics 100. That's the Introduction to Economics. That's even a notch below 151 and 152. And so this brings back nice memories. Let me ask you this. How many of you have never had any economics? Okay. I'm used to that, okay? Economics 100, when I taught it, was for students who hadn't had any. What I'm going to do, some of you probably have had some econ. I'm going to make sure, do my best to start you from scratch here, assuming you may not have a lot of background, and yet you really want to know about what's going on with our economy, what the policies are, what the choices are, how the administration's been doing, and so on. So that's what we're going to do. I don't have much time, so let's get started. First, where are we today? Well, we're not in a good situation. Now let's take a look at this graph. This is the real GDP, or real output, GDP, gross domestic product, total output of the economy. And from 2004, it was growing at a nice normal rate. And we get to here in 2008, and look what happens. We drop off a cliff, okay? And here's where we are now in 2009. Now, when the economy hits a peak and then drops, that's called a recession. When the economy stops dropping, the technical term recession is defined such that the recession's over once we start back up. Now, does that mean our economic problem is over if we're down here and we're just starting back up? How many of you have heard, maybe the recession's over? Have any of you heard that in newspapers and so on? Okay. That's great that we're not doing this, continuing to plunge. But we've got a long way to go. It's as though you're up on the rim of the Grand Canyon and you're overcome with the view, and you take a false step and you go plunging down, rolling, hitting boulders, and you go down about 9 miles to the Colorado River. And now you stop falling because there's nothing further you can fall. Okay? That's where we are. The fall is over. You got a long hike to get way back up to the rim, and that's where we are. The counterpart, so before I finish, let me point this out. Our output of our economy, we are underproducing about 6% of what we normally potentially should and could be producing now. Okay, we're producing way below potential. The counterpart to that, which every one of you is directly concerned with, is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate, the percent of those people who want to work, are able to work, trying to get jobs, but who aren't working. Well, let's take a look. Way back 1990, you can see figures like 6%. We had a recession that drove it up to about 8%. Then we had a boom period in the late 1990s with unemployment rate down around 4%. Then we had a stock market plunge and a recession. But the unemployment rate, because we were starting low, in 2001 only went a little over 6%. Not too bad. Bad enough to make some of my students back then who were graduating have a tough time, good students, finding jobs. All right. Then the unemployment rate was relatively low until we get to 2008. And you can see what's happened here. The unemployment rate has gradually moved up to where it is now 9.7% actually, with one more, 6 or 9.7. All right. That is extraordinarily high. That is the counterpart to that output gap. Because we're underproducing, the employers don't need as many workers. Therefore, they're not hiring as many, and they've laid off some. And the number of people unemployed looking for work is extraordinarily high. We haven't been this high since the early 1980s, where we did actually cross 10% for several months. Now, to keep it perspective, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, in that catastrophe, the unemployment rate reached 25%. 1 out of 4 people who wanted to work couldn't. We're nowhere near there, and we're not going to go anywhere near there. But this is bad enough. Okay. How did we get there? Well, there's a long story and there's a short story. I'm going to oversimplify. It's all the time I've got, because I want to make sure I spend plenty of time on what are the policy options of what we can do about it. But let me briefly tell you a little bit about how we got there. Now, a free market economy is a tremendous engine, I don't want to be misinterpreted, is a tremendous engine of productivity, of production, and of raising of the standard of living. If you look over the long run, a free market economy has done tremendous things to build up the standard of living of people in our country and around the world. There are problems with it. There are inequities. I'm not saying it's all perfect by any means, even in general. But you always have to keep in mind that it has done tremendous things for our standard of living. However, having said that, a free market economy now and then gets in trouble. The very enthusiasm to innovate and invest and start new businesses, etc., that produces a lot of the upward move of production and productivity, people sometimes get carried away. Investors get carried away. They bid up stock prices or home prices to very high levels. They get overexcited about certain investment opportunities. People overdo it. They overdo it in their personal life, and they overdo it in business and economic life. Every now and then we get in trouble. You can just look at the history of free market economies, and every couple of years we get a financial crisis, a stock market plunge, the economy moves down, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. Then we recover, especially if we do the right policies, we recover faster, and we move on. Okay. In 2000, 2001, let's look at the late 90s. In the late 90s, we had tremendous innovation in information technology, in the internet, in the spreading of computers, etc. Great steps forward in our standard of living. But investors and people got a little carried away. They bid the stock market way up, even on companies that just promised that they were going to do information technology. Okay. In around 2000, people said suddenly, gee, we bid these prices up way too high in the stock market. We don't even know if these companies are solid. I'm going to sell my stock. And as people did that, the stock market plunged in 2000, 2001. When the stock market plunges, middle-aged people especially, you folks haven't built up your stocks yet in general, most of you. There are a few folks who fit middle age, I think I see here in the audience. We look at our portfolios of stocks and bonds and their worth. If we see that falling, we say, whoa, I better save more for retirement. I don't have as much as I thought. I better cut my consumption, my spending, to save more. But when people cut their spending, what do retailers do? They see demand dropping for their products. They cut their orders to manufacturers. Manufacturers cut their employment, lay people off, and you go into recession. That's what happened in 2000, 2001. Well, we pulled out of it. We had a couple of pretty good years. Then the new run-up of prices was in what sector? In 2006 and 2007? The housing sector. Okay. The enthusiasm that had been put in the stock market in the late 90s Now it really moved into housing, and that became the new sure investment, lots of people said. Well, again, let me be very brief on this. Banks said, let's make loans to if anybody wants to buy a home, even if the person doesn't have such a good track record and may not be able to afford to repay. Now, why would banks do that? Well, if they were going to keep the loans, they wouldn't. But a new invention had occurred in the financial sector. Banks were going to make the loan to people, even if they might not ultimately be able to make the mortgage payments. But a few months later, those banks were going to sell those loans to investors and no longer hold them. It was like a game of hot potato. The banks would make the loan, but instead of holding it, they sold it to other financial investors. They were the ones then holding the hot potato. If the homeowners couldn't pay, they'd be the ones stuck. The banks would be in the clear. So the banks didn't monitor as carefully who they were lending to because they knew they would get rid of those loans. Now, I'm greatly oversimplifying, okay? But that's what I've got to do tonight in 40 minutes. All right. The investors, what did they do? They thought it was going to be okay because they said, even if these people can't pay their mortgages, home prices always go up. Look at how they're rising. We can take the home if somebody can't pay their mortgage and sell those homes at high prices. We'll be okay, thought the investors. But some of them said, in case we're not okay, we're going to buy insurance from companies like AIG. How many of you have heard of AIG? A huge insurance company. AIG said, we will sell insurance, meaning if those loans you bought, if their mortgages can't be paid, if the people actually can't pay them, we will reimburse you. So the investors said, we're willing to buy these mortgages because even if they go bad, we have insurance. Now, AIG should have thought twice about this. Okay, but they just said, well, home prices keep going up. We don't think we're going to have to pay off the insurance. Now, as I'm sure many of you know, AIG became one of the biggest financial problems in this entire crisis. They completely ran out of funds because what happened? Sure enough, it turned out many of those who took those mortgages out and called subprime mortgages couldn't pay. When they couldn't pay, the investors couldn't get their money. Could they sell the houses at high prices? No, because what had happened? Housing prices, instead of shooting up forever, had plunged. People had realized at a certain point, these houses are going for such inflated prices, I think I better sell. If I buy, I'm going to be stuck with a house which will come down in value later. People started selling, housing prices plunged. I want to emphasize there's nothing unusual about this in a free market economy. There are always these tremendous swings. When things are going up, people get over-enthusiastic. The last chairman of the Federal Reserve, before the current is Ben Bernanke. The one before it, I'm sure you have heard of him, Alan Greenspan. He used the phrase, sometimes markets have irrational exuberance. They get carried away irrationally sometimes. Same with the housing market. So when that plunged, the people who were counting on the mortgage payments, when they didn't come in, if they took the house and tried to sell it, they wouldn't get very much. The price was low. They turned to AIG to get their insurance reimbursement. AIG said, whoa, we had no idea that so many would be defaulting like this. We don't have the money. And the investors said, you've got to be kidding. And not just investors here, but investors around the world who had invested in this. We then moved into a financial crisis in 2008. Big firms that had always been thought solid were caught up in this, had invested in all of this. Okay. Now, so far, you might say, well, how does this affect the producers of the economy? They're just trying to produce goods and services, and they employ people to make it. The problem is the financial crisis spreads to the buyers of goods and services, the consumers who buy consumer goods, the businesses that buy investment goods, machinery, and the government that purchases computers or tanks for the military, etc. The three big buyers in the economy C, consumers. I, businesses buying machines, investment. G, government. How many of you have heard of, if you've taken a little econ, C plus I plus G, the total or aggregate demand in the economy by the buyers? Let's see hands. Any of you heard of that? Okay, good. When the consumers saw their houses plunging in value, then the stock market got nervous and plunged, consumers said, whoa, we better save more. When we retire, we're not going to be able to sell our house at a high price to finance our retirement. We need more saving. Consumers got worried, and they cut back their spending. Now, that was a sensible thing for each consumer to do, but what does it do to the retailers? Is that good or bad news? Bad. They see their sales dropping. Demand is dropping. They turn to the manufacturers, cut their orders to them. And that's how the cut in consumption demand coming from that financial crisis and the plunge in home prices, stock prices, takes one of the big three, C plus I plus G, and brings it down. Okay. Businesses, when they think, do I need more machinery? Well, they look at the consumers. They say, if the consumers are going to spend a lot more, I need more machines to produce more. But what are the consumers now doing? They're nervous. They're cutting their consumption and saving. The businesses say, we don't need more machines, and they cut their demand for machinery. Whoever's producing the machinery cuts their production, lays off workers. Okay. So C and I, not G, G held on, but C and I plunge, fall. Total demand in the economy falls. Now, economics, a lot of economics is about supply and demand, and each one has their place when you're doing the analysis. In certain situations, it's important to pay attention to supply. It's important to make sure that workers have an incentive to supply their labor, that they're not taxed too heavily and therefore feel, why should I work? It's important to make sure businesses aren't overtaxed, because then they won't have an incentive to try to earn profit if they can't keep much of it. So when you're in normal times, supply has to be paid attention to. But our problem in 2008, 2009, and I'll put the grim graph back up again, this is caused by a plunge in demand. I want to say that again. This is caused by a plunge in demand, C plus I plus G, but not the G part, falling. The suppliers would have only been too happy to keep producing as many products as they were producing up here and to continue on. There was no increase in tax rates in 2007, 8, or 9 that would have suddenly discouraged business from wanting to produce, or workers from wanting to work, or investors from saving. There was no tax increase in 2007, 8, and 9 that discouraged supply. If you ask businesses now, why aren't you producing more? They don't say, well, I don't get to keep as much of my profit. What do they say? The customers aren't there. The buyers aren't there. The problem is a plunge, a collapse of demand. And the solution for our short-run problem, recession problem, is to boost demand. We have to stimulate the consumers to spend more in the short run, and businesses then to spend more on their machinery, to invest more. If and when they do that, the producers will be delighted to produce more, rehire people, and pull us out of this valley and get us back on the normal track. Okay. All right, now how do we do that? There are three things that have to be done. First, the financial crisis that started the whole thing, from housing and then spreading to other institutions, banks, insurance companies, that has to be dealt with. And I'm going to go back to that in a minute. The second thing is the Federal Reserve has to bring interest rates way down so that consumers who might need to borrow to buy goods, or businesses that might need to borrow to buy machines, can get very low interest rates and have available credit. The third thing, and this is the one I'm going to talk most about, is what's called fiscal stimulus. Fiscal stimulus has several components. The first is tax cuts. Get more money into the pockets of ordinary people, of consumers, so they have more money to spend on goods. Get money into their pockets that they don't have to pay back. It's not like a loan. Cut their taxes, maybe even the government send checks out to them called tax rebates. Secondly, the government itself needs to increase its spending. And I want to emphasize, fiscal stimulus, like all of these three measures, are meant to be temporary. A recession is a temporary problem. It can last a few years. Once you get back up on track, you phase out the government's fiscal stimulus, you phase out the Federal Reserve's low interest rate policy, you bring interest rates back to normal. These are all temporary emergency policies, not permanent policies. Okay. The government, fiscal stimulus, the government has to raise its own spending. First of all, it has to send cash out to state and local governments because they're retrenching. Their tax revenue is dropping as less people are employed and pay taxes. If they're not going to lay off police and teachers, etc., the money's got to come in from somewhere. They're limited on what they can borrow. The federal government needs to send cash into them. That's a key component of fiscal stimulus. And finally, the federal government needs to itself fund infrastructure projects, repairing highways, etc., that put people to work. So to summarize again, fiscal stimulus is first and foremost tax cuts and getting cash into the pockets of consumers so they can spend more. Second, it's the federal government sending cash to the state and local governments so they won't lay people off, teachers, fire, police, etc. And third, the government funds construction projects that keep people working. Okay. Now, let's go back into 2008. In early 2008, President Bush and the Bush administration supported, and so did the Democratic Congress, some fiscal stimulus. By today's standards, relatively small, but they took a good first step, and there was bipartisan support for doing it. Now, here's what they were looking at. Let me put up for you the timeline of unemployment rate. So here we are in 2008. The unemployment rate, January, February, is nice and low. Low means 5% or lower. But now, as we move forward, the unemployment rate's going to start to move up. And yet, even in early 2008, there were signs in the housing market of trouble, the kind I described. So the Bush administration and the Democratic majority in Congress passed a stimulus bill. It was about $150 billion. About $100 billion were tax rebate checks that got sent out to households to help them afford keeping up their consumption. And about $50 billion was aimed at businesses to give them an incentive to keep up their buying machines, their investment. And it helped. It helped. So it was a good first step in the right direction. However, as we moved into the middle of this year and more financial institutions began to get in trouble, and as we moved into the fall, it was September of last year when the big financial institution Lehman Brothers, instead of being rescued by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, which they had done to other institutions like Bear Stearns and a few others, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two big government lending institutions. Those had all been rescued. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury decided, we're going to let Lehman Brothers go. They sort of deserve it. They overlent into bad loans, and they let Lehman Brothers fail. When Lehman Brothers failed, a panic swept the whole financial sector of the economy. All the lenders didn't want to lend anymore because they said, we need our money badly or we might go bankrupt like Lehman Brothers. The economy's financial sector froze up. We had a tremendous crisis. Finally, both the Federal Reserve and the Bush administration, and the Secretary of the Treasury then was Henry Paulson, they worked hard to try to send emergency rescue funds into the financial institutions. and they did succeed in preventing a catastrophe. This had bipartisan, and who supported this? The Bush administration, President Bush, obviously Republican, and his Secretary of the Treasury, they led and supported this. The chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, and the Fed supported the rescue following Lehman of the rest of the financial sector. And the Democrats in Congress supported it. Most of the opposition came from a good percentage of the Republicans who felt this was too much intervention by government in the free enterprise system. But again, to be fair here, President Bush and his administration supported and led this along with the Democrats in Congress, the financial rescue of last fall. So although there were things that could have been done to try to prevent this from happening, and there's a lot of fault to go around, I don't have time to get into it. Finally, when the administration, the Fed, and the Democratic Congress faced up to this in September of last year, they did a reasonably good job. The rescue of the financial sector has continued in the Obama administration. Some of you were saying, when's he going to get to the Obama administration? I'm watching the clock, but I need to set the stage if you're to appreciate. So on financial rescue, the first essential thing that had to be done to stop this crisis, the Obama administration continued and developed further, and I think for the most part effectively, the rescue of the financial institutions. Of course, it's Secretary now Geithner, the head of the Economic Council for the President, Larry Summers, and others who've been involved in this rescue operation. Federal Reserve as well. Huge amounts of money were injected by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury into financial institutions to make sure they have the funds to be able to continue lending, to not retrench, and so forth. All right, so that was good. Now, there are some who opposed all of that, particularly at the right side of the political spectrum, again, feeling too much government intervention. We'll never be able to run the experiment of what would have happened if we hadn't injected all this money into these institutions. It's possible they would have survived, and it's possible we would have moved in the direction of a Great Depression. But we won't know because it didn't happen, because the rescue occurred. Secondly, this I can be brief on. The Federal Reserve over the year 2008 cut interest rates in the economy down to close to zero for the rate that they focus on, and they brought other interest rates down. That was all the correct thing to do. But the problem is, when people get as worried and nervous and anxious as American consumers are by everything that took place, and the same for American business, even interest rates that are very low are not enough to induce people to borrow and spend. After all, when you borrow, you have to pay it back. And so the Fed did the right thing, but the Fed does not have enough power by just cutting interest rates to pull us out of the valley. And here's where fiscal stimulus comes in, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. As I said, in early 2008, the Bush administration and the Democratic Congress passed a fiscal stimulus package. They passed it in February. It didn't actually go into the economy until the summer of 2008 because it took time to get the tax rebate checks sent out to people. It helped some, but once the economy got into this plunge, much more was going to be needed. Now, here was, to me, the first great mistake in the handling of this recession. And here I really fault the Bush administration for it. After taking a nice first step in February of 2008, supporting the first fiscal stimulus package, most of the Democrats in Congress by the summer, so let's look at the timeline, as the unemployment rate is creeping up in 2008, we're getting May, June, we're getting 5.0, 5.5, 5.6, 5.8. Most of the Democrats are saying we need a second round of stimulus. To me, very unfortunately, the Bush administration said we are done with stimulus for the year. We are now working only on financial rescue. Now, they were right that financial rescue was a top priority. They were wrong, in my humble opinion, to say they couldn't do two things at once, that they couldn't put a bigger fiscal stimulus into the economy while they worked on financial rescue. We wasted a full year from February of 2008, when the first package was enacted. We went a full year until February of this year, 2009, before we enacted another fiscal stimulus package. The Democrats in Congress, the Democratic presidential candidates were all calling for more fiscal stimulus in the summer of 2008. But the White House could veto it. And the White House said, we are not going to sign this. We're just going to do financial rescue. We don't want to do any more of this fiscal stimulus. Now, again, you might say this seems crazy. I think it is, but let me be fair. There's concerns about fiscal stimulus. If it's not temporary, if you cut taxes and you raise government spending, and you don't just do it for an emergency, 1 or 2 years, but you do it forever, how does the government get the money to spend here but tax way down here? It has to borrow. Borrowing in an emergency for a while is sensible, is necessary. If you get into a habit and you're going to do it forever, you'll run up huge debt and, like any family or business, get in long-run trouble. Well, some on the conservative side said, I'm worried about too much borrowing by the government, and I'm opposed to it even now in the emergency. To me, that's very misguided. In normal times, be disciplined in your fiscal affairs. Don't do excessive borrowing. Try to avoid borrowing. Have very low debt, so when you get into an emergency, you can do the borrowing you need. That's the way we should run our government and probably our families generally in businesses. Okay. But in the emergency, you've got to be ready to borrow. But anyway, we lost a full year. Now, as soon as the new administration comes in, at the top of their list, well, right with financial rescue, is fiscal stimulus. And the administration proposes, and they get through Congress with Democratic majority and lots of opposition from almost all of the Republicans voting no. They get a big, I'm not going to say huge, it's big compared to the last one, fiscal stimulus package enacted last February. The one in 2008 was $150 billion. The one enacted in February 2009 was a little more than $750 billion, 5 times as big. The size matters, okay? That's a big step in the right direction. Great credit, then, to those who led the push to get that stimulus. And you might think that somebody like me should say, I'm not going to criticize if they move that much in the right direction. But I am going to criticize because it was not nearly enough. And let me put up what I need to put up here. Okay. First, let me go back to when this was passed. Now, the stimulus doesn't go rolling right into the economy. It takes time. The first thing they did, and they got this done, it started in April. They enacted it in February. The paychecks of most people, out of the paycheck, I'm sure you all know this by now, taxes are withheld. Federal income tax, state income taxes, payroll taxes, federal, okay. The federal income tax, the amount withheld was cut by the act, passed this February. So that starting in April, less was being and it's continuing today, is being taken out of each person's paycheck. That leaves more money for people to spend. And it's helping. Okay, that's the first thing, but it took time. Other projects are only gradually occurring. Money is being sent into states so that there's less cutback of teachers and police than there otherwise would have been. All of those things are helping. Now, if we had not done stimulus, this was the forecast using a macroeconometric model that I think is a relatively good one. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's run by Professor Ray Fair of Yale University, one of the experts in running and producing and running these kind of models. Several months ago, when he did a forecast, he said if there had been no stimulus enacted by the Obama administration and the Democratic Congress, here's what the unemployment rate would look like. Economists do this by quarters, right? 3 months. In the second quarter of 2009, if there'd been no stimulus, 9.1. The third quarter, 9.8. The fourth quarter, 10.4. The first quarter of next year, 10.7, 10.8, 10.8. This is the path unemployment would be forecast to be if we hadn't had the big stimulus, fiscal stimulus passed. With the current stimulus, significantly better. By the middle of next year, according to this forecast, the stimulus would make the unemployment rate 2 points lower, 8.8 instead of 10.8, than it otherwise would have been. A 2-point cut is a great achievement. Okay. But 8.8 is still very high. The people who voted no, unfortunately, the debate in Congress was between the people who wanted this current stimulus, the administration, and the people who voted no against any stimulus, according to this model, would have led to this path. All right, so we should be thankful for this. However, if there had been a stronger stimulus, the results would have been better. Let me put up one more table for you. Okay. Actually, 2 more. Okay, first, the current stimulus is putting into the economy roughly $100 billion in each quarter. Now we're moving up a quarter. I'm starting with the fourth quarter of this year. This is a newer forecast. $100 billion roughly is being put in by the fiscal stimulus package that was passed last February in each quarter. Okay. I'm in a minority of people who have been pushing for a year and a half at least for more stimulus, and especially in the last few months. Suppose we were to instead, for 2 quarters, instead of putting $100 billion in, this last quarter of this year that we're now beginning, and the first quarter of next, $400 billion instead of $100, quadruple the stimulus for the next 2 quarters. Instead of $100 billion, an additional $300, so it's $400 billion. Over the 2 quarters, it's $800 instead of $200, an additional $600 billion. What would happen? Okay, now where is my slide to show you? Here we go. According to this model, here's what would happen. Let me actually take 3 alternatives. There are some at the right end of the spectrum who say, let's terminate the stimulus. We never should have enacted it. According to this model, this is the path for unemployment. These are the kind of unemployment rates we will be facing if we were to foolishly do that. I'm saying, in my humble opinion, foolishly. Now, if we keep the current stimulus, we don't get down to 8 because the economy worsened since the original forecast I just showed you. But still, we'll get 9.1% unemployment the end of next year instead of 10.5. That's a help compared to terminating. But if we quadruple the stimulus, we could get down to 7.1% unemployment. Still above normal, still not great. But if any of you are going to be graduating and looking for a permanent job, the difference between 7.1% unemployment rate and the 9.1 track we're on and the 10.5 we would have been on if we done nothing could make all the difference to you personally and to the production of our economy and the speed that we climb out of the valley. So, the frustration that I have is that the debate in our spectrum has been between those saying no fiscal stimulus and the Obama administration and the Democratic majority, which has moved a big step in the correct direction, but unfortunately, not nearly enough. Now, is it possible I'm being too pessimistic? Absolutely. It's also possible this forecast is too optimistic, and the unemployment rates will be even higher under the current policy. All you can do is use the best model that you have confidence in, put the numbers in, crank them out in the computer, and see what you think you need. Now, here's the final important point on this. Won't this raise our debt, even if we're only going to do this for a year or two? Won't it raise our government debt? Yes, it will. Is that something to worry about? And here's what's surprising. Even though our debt increases when the government puts $400 billion in the economy instead of $100 each quarter, and we have to borrow $300 more, the government does. Even though our debt then rises about $300 billion one quarter, $300 billion the next, a total of $600 billion. We stimulate the C plus I plus G, the aggregate demand of the economy. What does that do? It pulls the economy out of the valley. The output of the economy goes up. More income is being earned, more is being produced. Okay. If you look at the ratio of our government debt compared to our GDP, our total output, yes, our debt goes up when we do the larger fiscal stimulus, but so does our GDP, so does our total output and income because of the stimulation. Debt as a percent of GDP, when we run this through the model, goes up very little. So let me repeat that. Debt as a percent of our total GDP goes up very little because even though debt goes up, GDP goes up. There is therefore, in my view, no excuse concerning debt to not do this quadrupling of fiscal stimulus. We're only going to do it for 2 to 3 years. That's all it's going to take to get us out of this. Even in the short run, debt relative to GDP will rise very little. As long as we turn this off once we get back to normal, as long as we have discipline when times become normal again, this is the correct and right and responsible thing to do now. But I have to leave you again with this conclusion. I wish I could give an A or an A plus to the Obama economic policy. Do I give it a B? I can tell you whose policy I would have flunked. And all of you are on the front lines. I've got tenure. Older folks, some of them get laid off, but many hang on to their jobs. It's the new entrants to the labor force that bear the brunt of a recession. They're the ones who bear the brunt of a timidity on the part of the government to be aggressive enough in fiscal stimulus. I'm hoping that the administration and the Congress will wake up as soon as possible and say, you know what, we need a larger dose, we need it fast, we've got to get this done, we don't have enough in the pipeline. I now want to open it for questions or comments. Yes?
Do you consider $800 billion of new health care debt part of the stimulus package, number one? And number two, as an economist, when we have concern about Social Security and billions and tens of billions of dollars that Democrats and Republicans keep saying it needs to be fixed.
Right.
And Medicare needs to be fixed. Shouldn't you fix some of those problems before you start adding more and more stimulus and healthcare problems? I mean, that's the fear of the person who doesn't take economy classes as an average American.
Right, right. The long-term debt problem coming from Social Security, but mostly from Medicare and Medicaid, is very serious. It is a long-term problem that we keep failing to come to grips with. I agree with you completely. However, when you are facing the emergency of a plunge in consumer spending and business spending that's throwing people out of work and cutting production, you don't hold back treating that emergency because you still haven't done what you need to do for these long-term problems. We have got to work on these problems. I wrote a book on Social Security reform, on how you try to get that system in balance. We've been working on that for a long time, and we need to work on it, and we need to work on it first thing when we get out of this recession. But for us to say, because we haven't dealt with that, we shouldn't do the emergency measures needed to get out of the recession, I think would be a mistake. But your long-term concern is very valid. Yes?
Well, I have two questions. First of all, you said if we put 4 times as much into a stimulus, it would result in 4 times as much back to the consumer. But
That's all figured in, or attempted to be figured in this modeling. As a matter of fact, what the model assumes is that when you if you put $100 more in the paychecks of people, they'll spend maybe $20 of it. And they'll, in the short run, in the first quarter, they'll save and pay down debt with about 80. But that's fine. But that 20, as long as you make the amount you put in their pocket big enough, is enough to start you moving faster out of that valley.
And then my second question was something completely different. What do you think about the G20's recent move to delve into investment companies like paychecks and stuff like that?
Yeah. Now, something I did not mention at all is, what do we do to prevent this from happening again? By the way, we'll never perfectly prevent. As long as we have a free market economy, every decade or so, or 2 decades, we're going to have trouble. But we can reduce the frequency of it if we take some preventive measures. We need to say, again, I'm just going to give you a brief answer. If people who made bad investment decisions are able to end up keeping the huge sums of money that they earned, that's not good for the future, because 5 or 10 years down the road, the next group is going to say, what happened to the last group 10 or 15 years ago that made a lot of money in the short run, overdid it, and the economy collapsed? If they got to keep a lot of their money, I think some of them are going to say, let's do it again. So this is all important stuff for how to try to prevent this in the future, and I haven't in 40 minutes had the time to address that. Another thing would be, quickly, banks that make those loans on the front line should be required to keep a decent chunk of it, not be allowed to sell it all off to someone else. If they know they have to keep the loan, or a good part of it, they'll be careful in screening whether people can really repay. There are a whole bunch of things that need to be done. Yes?
There was an article that appeared in the New York Times magazine a couple weeks back that kind of talked about the problem with our economy actually relating to economists being overly optimistic.
Terrific article by Paul Krugman.
Yeah.
I agree with it 1,000%, and Krugman has been one of the, let me just summarize quickly for people. We in the economics profession, the profession as a whole should not hold its head high at all. Many in the profession over the last 30 years forgot the lessons that came out of the Great Depression, that an economy can get in trouble, that demand can plunge, that stock markets can plunge, and that government then has to step in temporarily to stimulate demand with monetary but also with fiscal stimulus. Half of the economics profession has not been teaching that. Half of us are. We're at war within the economics, within macroeconomics. And I'm completely behind my leader, Paul Krugman, who, by the way, is a Nobel Prize winner for not his work on this, work on international trade. There's a lot of fault to go around in all of this, and I think a lot of the fault, I won't name names, is of some of my fellow professionals in macroeconomics. And to this day, many of them are saying do nothing. Yes?
You were saying that, the fiscal stimulus works as long as you, go back to, keeping it in when things are normal again.
Right.
How do you define normal? How do you know when it's normal?
Well, normal would be if we get down to an unemployment rate of about 6 to 5%. Okay. Then we're pretty much there. You might say, why can't we go to 2 or 1%? Well, remember, there's always a certain amount of unemployment because we have freedom. People are free to quit. Businesses are free to say this employee is not doing a good job, and I'm going to let that employee go. We always have a certain amount of unemployment, even in a normal, healthy economy. All right? So once we climb out of the valley, wherever that diagram is, and we're back on our normal trend, and the unemployment rate is back down to between 5 and 6%, that's where we want to be. And we need discipline then. As a matter of fact, those of us that are for fiscal stimulus in an emergency have the greatest stake in advocating discipline. I mean, when I had that book that was mentioned, I wrote a few years ago on automatic fiscal policies to combat recession, because I said, we're going to get another one, and are we going to be ready? And unfortunately, we didn't enact those programs in advance, and we haven't been aggressive enough with them. But one of the things I said in that book was, in normal times, we have to have fiscal discipline. We have to get our budget balanced, maybe even some surpluses, taking in more in revenue than we're spending to pay down some debt. We need to run a tight ship in normal times so we're ready to spend in the emergency. Yes?
Are you nervous at all about inflation?
Inflation, very important. If the economy has too much demand, if people are spending over-enthusiastically, if C plus I plus G is higher than the producers can possibly meet because they're already employing almost everybody that wants to work. Well, what happens if the producers can't produce more and demand is rising, the customers are clamoring, the producers naturally will raise prices. That's called inflation. When they raise prices steadily, year after year, and that's harmful. We don't want that. But our problem is not too much demand, which causes inflation. Our problem is a plunge in demand, too little demand. So, we have to bring demand back up to normal. Once we get to normal, we have to stop. If we forget to stop and then we move demand up to too high, then we'll get inflation. But the people who would worry about this, it reminds me of people, imagine this room was 40 degrees. And suppose you felt cold. And suppose someone said, let's turn it up to 65 or 70. Suppose someone said, oh no, I don't want to risk that, because if you turn it up to 65 or 70, what if you keep turning it up and it goes to 90 or 100? Well, no, the solution is not to say I'm going to stay at 40 and freeze. It's I'm going to stimulate enough, warm it up enough to get to normal, and when I get to normal, I'm going to have the discipline to stop. And that's what we need to do with the economy. If we do that, we can avoid inflation and come out of this. Way in the back. Of the fiscal stimulus, the economists split on whether to do a financial rescue. Probably the majority said you probably have to rescue. The majority of economists said the Fed should get interest rates down to near zero. But when it comes to fiscal stimulus, cutting the taxes, getting cash in people's pockets, raising government spending to send more money into the state and local governments, etc., I'd say it would be, I don't know if it's I'd like to see a survey. I think it's probably a 50-50 split, okay, which is very frustrating to me. And some of you should rightly say, I got to find out what the opposition is. You know, this just, why is it, well, Krugman tried to deal with some of those reasons. There's some economists who, I think he's right, they fall in love with mathematical model of the economy that just assumes that a free market economy works perfectly and doesn't get in trouble and everybody's rational. And they love doing the math of it. It's one reason. And it's a lot of fun to do that. It's a lot of fun, and it takes a lot of intellectual brilliance. I take my hats off to some of them. Some of them have won Nobel Prizes. I just don't think they're modeling the real world. Yes?
Your example with the temperature in the room, like good stimulus until we get back to where we were and then we stop. So do you think in the future it's going to be like every decade or so we'll get back with decreasing the GDP and we'll have to do this huge stimulus, like recurring, is it going to be a recurring thing?
Yeah, we might have to do this every 10, 20 years. I think if we put preventive measures in, we can make it less frequent. I think it's an illusion to think that you can have a free market. See, our free market economy runs on enthusiasm, and sometimes the enthusiasm, most of the time, it produces great things, great innovations, electricity, computers, medical advances, you name it. But sometimes a necessary byproduct of that is sometimes it gets carried away. And so I think we're always going to have some of that. If we have to deal with this every 10 or 20 years, the fiscal stimulus needed to do it is easily manageable. If the rest of the time we are using fiscal discipline, we can run that forever. Yes?
When you were mentioning the solutions to getting people to spend more and invest more, you mentioned three things. One was the fiscal stimulus. What were the other two?
Well, the first thing was you had to have the financial rescue. You had to rescue the banks, the financial institutions. If they froze up and wouldn't lend because they were so afraid, that stops the economy in its tracks. So that had to be done. It's very unpleasant to see institutions that had gotten us into a lot of trouble by irresponsible lending being rescued or bailed out. But we don't want to destroy ourselves just because we're going to have to rescue some people that don't deserve it. An institution, seems to me. The other was interest rates by the Federal Reserve have to be brought down to a very low level, and that was done. But the real interest rates don't have enough power in this kind of climate to do the trick. You've got to get fiscal stimulus. Yes?
Are you concerned about a weakening dollar and China making moves about not wanting our debt anymore? Wouldn't that have been made worse by sanctions?
Well, you know, we've had a big trade deficit for many years. We've been borrowing from abroad. Having the dollar come gradually down so we can sell more exports because our goods are cheaper is something a lot of economists, including me, have thought would be a desirable thing to do, provided it's gradual. Now, so far, we have not had any kind of dramatic move of the dollar. I think we do need to worry about the Chinas and the other groups in the world who invest in us in having discipline in normal times. China itself is now involved in a large fiscal stimulus, which is very fortunate for not only them, but for us. I don't think our doing more fiscal stimulus in this emergency is more likely to cause a problem there. And at any rate, we can't afford to worry about that now. We've got to take care of this. This is urgent front burner. Well, we'll get maybe one more question at most, and then you've been very patient. Anybody else? Yes, last one.
How much of a factor on stimulus is China's purchase of like $1 trillion in bonds in the U.S.?
Well, their buying bonds doesn't stimulate our products directly. When I talk about stimulus, I mean getting it to the people that buy goods and services. So the effect is indirect. To put a summary on it, our fate is in our own hands here in terms of this short-run problem. We can get out of this with aggressive fiscal stimulus supported by financial rescue, supported by low interest rates, regardless of what the others do. If others in the world stimulate, it's going to make it easier for all of us because we buy their products, they buy our products. But we can do it. But if we're not aggressive enough, some of my very best students are going to face tough times. And so the stakes are high, particularly for you folks, to pay attention to this. Thanks very much.